I get in a lot of trouble. I've said this repeatedly. People get very angry with me when I say this. I always see the statement, racism has no place in our society. I disagree with that. I don't like it. I wish nobody would be racist. I wish we would have no racism. But again, it is not the business of a free society to say that any view is absolutely intolerable.
And what do you say to people who call you a racist, James, for bringing all this up?
If somebody actually calls me a racist in practice right now, I mostly just ignore it. I get called a racist like 1,000 times a day on Twitter. I just don't care. If it's like a friend or a family member, I start straight off with, well, what do you mean by that? When you say I'm a racist, very specifically, what do you mean by that? And let's clarify it.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is James Lindsay, the American author, academic, and political commentator. Your work explores political and social issues, and your essays have been published in the New York Times, the LA Times, USA Today, and Time Magazine. In 2018, you wrote bogus papers on race, gender, and sexuality that were accepted and published in prestigious academic journals, proving a bias to accept dubious science in order to further their own social and political agendas. Your upcoming book, Cynical Theories, How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, exposes and counters cancel culture, social media dog piles, and woke ideologies. James, welcome to London Real.
I'm glad to be here.
Hey, great to have you. Before we get started, I just want to announce that we are streaming now on our new Digital Freedom platform, which is a censorship-free, independent broadcasting system that is of the people, by the people, for the people, and available exclusively on our website at freedomplatform.tv. Can everyone watching us now please share this link via the sidebar to any and all of your social media channels? Let me just repeat that. Can everyone watching us now please share this link via the sidebar? This is important. Just ask your friends and family to give us 15 minutes and then they can decide. James, I pledge to you and everyone watching us that none of this conversation will be edited, censored, removed, or banned, and that anyone in the world can watch the full version of this episode free at freedomplatform.tv/Lindsay. Thanks to the generous donations of over 34,000 people around the world that we affectionately call the London Real Army. For anybody wanting to become a founding member of the Digital Freedom Platform, they can visit freedomplatform.tv/give to donate and fight with us on the front lines to protect our human rights. Here at London Real, we've been a platform for free speech since 2011. And James, I'm excited to have you here today. Maybe we can start and talk a little bit about censorship. You know, we've been in a pretty public battle for the last 3 months against a lot of platforms, including YouTube, where a lot of our content has just been taken down, censored. I've been told in no uncertain terms that we are one upload away from being completely deplatformed on YouTube. This is 9 years of content, 8,000 videos, 250 million views. And maybe we can talk about that. I know you had recently been kind of temporarily banned on Twitter, and now you're back. Why are we being censored now, or why are we being censored at all? Do you have some thoughts on that before we jump into your adventures?
I mean, it depends on how deep you want to go. I have a large swath of thoughts on why we might be being censored at the moment, and what sorts of discourses are being suppressed and why. If you want to get really deep into it, we can. But yeah, I did get bumped off of Twitter for approximately 12 hours with no explanation whatsoever. I was writing, in fact, I'm writing an encyclopedia of social justice terminology for my website, New Discourses. And I was actually writing the entry for exclusion and for my encyclopedia when I then came back to my web browser and noticed that I had been excluded from Twitter. And then I just was let back in about 12 hours later with no explanation whatsoever ever given, no answer to my help ticket that I sent to Twitter, nothing. So I don't know what that was about. I don't know why it happened. We recently had a video we uploaded to YouTube where my colleague Helen Pluckrose, who is one of the most, I guess, mild-mannered, least dangerous people that you could possibly imagine, gave a talk explaining the postmodern roots of the current social justice activism. So she's just talking about philosophy, French philosophy as it morphed into American philosophy over the past 50 years or so. And that video was deemed unmonetizable, not suitable for all advertisers, with no explanation after a human reviewed it. So there is probably some sort of censorship going on. The reason, in short, is that the ideology we're dealing with believes that discourses, the way things are spoken about, are constitutive of reality. So reality is made by the way we think, and the way we think is shaped by the way we speak, what we consider to be legitimate, what we consider to be true. And so if they can engineer what we say and think and share and are exposed to, then they can stamp oppression out of the world by making sure that nobody gets the wrong discourses in their head. Hence calling my website New Discourses.
Okay, and I think that's probably a reasonable supposition. Is there a they? I mean, the strange thing about this is that we're talking about a handful of people. I could probably count them on one or two hands in Silicon Valley that are probably controlling 98% of the digital communications out there, between Mr. Zuckerberg, the CEOs of Google or Alphabet, and Dorsey. I mean, it's just a few people too, and they seem to all have the same politics. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, James?
So, I mean, I don't know a whole lot about the specifics of who believes what and where they're positioned. I do know that tech is rather heavily taken by this ideology that is concerned with discourse engineering. So I do think that it's likely that a small number of people with similar or identical politics with regard to certain views of discourse or free speech or whatever, have the power through these platforms that kind of create the digital public square to affect massive amounts of censorship in alignment with their own views or their moral beliefs about how the world should be ordered. And so it's an interesting situation we find ourselves in, where a very small number of people who have particular sensitivities, as all human beings do, can enforce upon the entire digital public square their moral sensibilities, with very few actors doing so. So when I say, who are they in terms of the censorship? I don't know. It could have been just Twitter's algorithms that were tripped by a handful of activists going and flagging a bunch of my content. That's a thing you can do, apparently. There's a number of things that could have happened, and Twitter, itself probably has no idea. So it's very, very unclear who they are, except that there is a very definite ideology that can be pinned to a very definite line of thought that has been developing and being taught in our universities and then our primary and secondary education systems now for a number of decades, that inform this line of thinking and would lead to possibly that handful of very influential tech magnates having a certain view of the world that they can then enforce.
I always try to look at it like not from a conspiracy standpoint, although I've had some people talk about that on my show. And I just try to think, I'm assuming these are pretty reasonable people. They run businesses, they've created businesses, and yet what they're doing, it seems kind of like it has this weird agenda. And I try to give them the benefit of the doubt and just thinking that I believe they're probably doing what they think is right. But I just wonder how controlling speech could ever be deemed as right. And unless you think that the things that we are talking about are so wrong and bad that they need to be suppressed, or is it about money at the end of the day and advertising? I don't know. I'm curious what you think.
I think yes, both. So certainly you could imagine if it were a religious movement that had somehow started to take over, and you started to have a large number of new religious converts in the halls of power that decided they wanted to make everything to be their particular new sect of Christianity. Often new converts to a religion are kind of on fire for, whatever the faith teaches. And so you can imagine that there's a spread of a religious movement that then the people who have bought into it want to enforce. and to put into the structure of everything. I mean, you've seen this, we see this throughout history. Everywhere there's been a serious religious movement, its adherents want it in the schools, they want it in the government, they want it in the laws, they want it everywhere they can get it, until it kind of gets tamed and simmers down a bit. And so I think of this very much as a religious movement, and the people who have taken it up are actually people who see themselves as good people, who want to be good people, who want to do the right thing, and they believe in this. So that motivates them to do it. On the other hand, there are also rivers of money behind it. And it's not just necessarily advertising money. There are large amounts of money flowing through what you might call woke Inc., which is kind of a nickname you could give to the diversity training industry. It's now a $10+ billion a year industry. Before recent events have put it in literally everything. There's also rivers and rivers of money coming out of nonprofit organizations, 501c3s and 4s, that are grant giving. And it's a very common tactic within grant giving institutions that have a strong political agenda to give large grants, then tell people after they've built up their infrastructure a few years and become dependent on having large grants to say, hey, you know what, we're ready to give you another grant if you make a few changes in the way that your company's direction is going. And so it's very easy. You don't have to even be a conspirator at this point. You can just say that, oh, well, we have small numbers of people by definition who are probably billionaires or running billion-dollar plus or multi-million-dollar plus grant giving institutions who have a particular agenda they want to see pushed into the world, and they are putting their money to work where they think it should go. And there are certain ways to make sure your agenda gets pushed that way. It comes up in the right, it comes up on the left. And right now, these kind of left-wing think tanks and foundations are dumping rivers of gold into intersectionality and into critical race theory, into all of these movements and the theory behind them that's flooding our society all of a sudden.
Yeah, we just saw like Soros announce, I think 220 million that he's dumping in. I mean, he was already a big contributor into, well, we rumored Black Lives Matter, but other organizations that are promoting similar agendas. And these are these 5-year grants they're talking. And I'm guessing there's more money behind that as well. So yeah, we've seen that on a public announcement, although we've kind of know that's been going on behind the scenes. Do you think to some extent when they look at the other side, which I guess in this case is symbolized by probably President Trump and other people on the right, that they can look at that as this thing that we're battling and maybe justify almost by any means necessary, or we have to all do this thing and really push to kind of get over this battle that we're fighting maybe in the next 4 months?
Very effectively, yes. So if we want to backtrack into the philosophy a little bit, we can go back to 1965 with a particular philosopher who was at the time at Columbia University named Herbert Marcuse, a very famous name. He was one of the post-war major critical theorists of the Frankfurt School, which had relocated to Columbia to escape the Nazis. And in 1965, Herbert Marcuse wrote a very famous essay that has been reproduced a large number of times called Repressive Tolerance, where he creates a sustained argument that in a world in which fascism has ever come to exist at all, we live in a permanent state of emergency, that fascism is always right around the corner. And so we have to engage in a new understanding of tolerance that is utterly intolerant of anything that looks like intolerance. You have to stamp out fascism before it can take root, because once it takes root, it's unstoppable. And his arguments were appealing, I think, rather sloppily to the rise of fascism and the Nazis and so on in Europe in the years preceding World War II in particular. And so he created a belief on the activist far left, that's not necessarily liberals, but leftist activists, that we live in a permanent state of emergency wherein any speech that could possibly, or any behavior or any representation or any approach to learning or teaching or knowledge or anything in society that could potentially lead to what they define as fascism must be fought tooth and nail like it's an existential emergency. And right after he published that, of course, that was 1965. It got a lot of traction in 1967 and 1968, and we saw very similar behaviors happening then. With the election of Donald Trump, this exact narrative was reinvigorated. We have a fascist in the White House. He's a racist. He's a sexist. In the years since, racism, sexism, homophobia, and so on have all been linked into being forms of fascism or proto-fascism. And so the election of Donald Trump, for everybody who had sufficient sympathies to this leftist argument, this very radical leftist argument, the election of Donald Trump became proof positive that we are now in the crisis situation. We are now facing a clear, hostile, Nazi-style takeover of the United States that must be resisted by any means necessary. So this is not just, kind of a mindset. This is a deeply rooted view that has profound, philosophical history. And you think it's maybe irrelevant. Oh, well, Herbert Marcuse, who's ever heard of Herbert Marcuse? Not that many people. Well, Herbert Marcuse had a student named Angela Davis, and Angela Davis had a student named Kimberly Crenshaw. Kimberly Crenshaw invented critical race theory and intersectionality, which are currently the things behind the movement. Ibram Kendi, whose books are now topping the bestseller list, How to Be an Anti-Racist, but more importantly, Stamped from the Beginning. Stamped from the Beginning, his book from a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, I think, covers the stories of 5 historical figures, one of whom is Angela Davis. And so Herbert Marcuse's ideas are definitely still active, definitely still having an impact. Antifa was basically built off of Herbert Marcuse's ideas combined with that of a French psychoanalyst and post-colonial thought named Frantz Fanon. So these ideas are occasionally, apparently, in history in the Western democracies since World War II, occasionally going to flare up. And when they do, they cause mass riots, they cause mass chaos, they cause this potential breakdown of civil society with the agenda to cause exactly that. And they have deep roots that have not been adequately addressed and have been allowed to fester in activist and academic circles for decades.
And you mentioned Antifa, which kind of stands for anti-fascists, and yet in some ways they look like the fascists because they seem to be attacking things that could be fascism. And we've never really seen this from the left. Historically, this comes from the right, and everyone's kind of making this observation. Am I stating that correctly? And why is this happening now?
Well, you are saying it correctly. The long and short is that Antifa, following the argument in repressive tolerance, believes that any seed of fascism has to be stamped out while it's a seed. You could say that it's almost like the would you go back in time and kill baby Hitler argument. So they're looking for baby Hitler everywhere. And they firmly believe that it is a moral imperative to kill baby Hitler before baby Hitler has a chance. But luckily, they're not killing very many people yet. They're mostly just canceling people, getting them removed from any position of power, influence, status, anything that might lead them to teach people or have journalistic, standing where they can push out an alternative narrative, because they are motivated by the belief that baby Hitler is everywhere, and it's their job to find baby Hitler by their definitions and their standards and to root it out. The reason it's flaring up now, I think, is because these veins of scholarship that have grown out of those lines of thought have come to full maturity in the academy. They've become standard to be taught in both university curriculums and in our K through 12 curriculums for about the last decade. They are actually made a part of every university curriculum. Almost every college in the United States has some form of a diversity course requirement that teaches this way of thinking about the world, at least in part, although I'm hearing from more and more students that it's in most of their classes to some degree now. Not so much in math, but pretty much everything short of that already. If they take psychology, it's going to dive into the psychology of racism and so on and so forth. So then we had a series of events that the, say, Black Lives Matter movement was very successful at capitalizing upon to push this narrative. The narrative is that racism and fascism are hidden everywhere in society. Everybody in society participates in these, is complicit in these, supports and maintains these, and hides it behind a nice seeming mask. So they're really racist, but they pretend they're not. And it's a matter of agitating them until their mask slips, and then you call them out for it. So this narrative has been building for a number of years. It mainstreamed significantly after the Ferguson shooting in 2014 of Michael Brown. And then it's impossible to overstate how significant it was to mainstreaming this narrative on the left half of the political aisle when Donald Trump was elected in a seemingly inexplicable election that nobody foresaw. I mean, people were going into therapy. They were shutting down workplaces and schools so people could cry for a week when this election happened. And people really did, across much of the left, believe that we have now installed our first American dictator with the election of Donald Trump. And so it's impossible to overstate how significant that was in terms of shaping the view that we are on the precipice of fascism and that baby Hitler has to be identified everywhere it can be. And since they can't seem to actually touch Trump, whether that be fully legitimate or somewhat illegitimate or whatever it is, since they can't seem to touch Trump, they have to do it other ways. They have to change the culture that elected Trump, and now they will do so by any means necessary, especially as his re-election begins to look more possible. I mean, is anybody excited that Joe Biden was the winner of the Democratic primaries? I don't think anybody was excited about that. So, they didn't get one of their radicals to go up against him. Their vision for the world looks like it's being squashed again. Radical action taking to the streets is a typical kind of behavior that you see out of radicals in such situations.
Right. That's a really good description. I mean, and that makes a lot of sense, that they feel powerless and they feel like unless they do something different, nothing's going to change. He's going to get reelected. They've already dealt 4 years of this. I mean, obviously he would get reelected if, I guess, more people voted for him, or maybe the Electoral College voted for him. But now they want to do something. And now you see these weird behaviors. And we can maybe get into some of this about how the Black Lives Matter manifests in corporations. I mean, speaking of YouTube, I just checked their Twitter feed and it's all black. It's been black for a long time. You got the mayor of New York painting Black Lives Matter on Fifth Avenue in front of Trump Towers. Mm-hmm. It just seems wacky to me that, a political movement, which, has every right to move forward, is being co-opted by corporations and the mayor of a city. It just seems like science fiction to me. Yeah, I don't know.
Pretty shocking. I mean, the most banal explanation for it is that this is what happens in a moral panic. So if you get enough people super sensitive to a particular narrative, and then you end up having the kind of flashpoint piece of evidence that seems to confirm it, you can often spark a moral panic that, our society is indelibly corrupt, whether it's sin and now we have to root out witches, whether it's, being in league with the devil and now we have to do whatever that takes, whether it's we're indelibly racist. I mean, this narrative has been being pushed very vigorously, again, all throughout our education system, strongly through our media, especially since Trump got elected. So at least going back to 2015, even when his campaign started to be serious. I remember in early 2016 writing an essay that I later took down, but I wrote an essay that said, if you want Trump to win, keep calling him racist. And because it set such a low bar, he just has to cross like plausible deniability of not being a racist, and well, there's nothing wrong with him then. So even then, this narrative has been being pushed so vigorously that it's basically, if you want a metaphor, you can think of it as laying, pine needles and dry tinder everywhere, and then you end up with a killing of a black person by a white police officer, and the spark lands in the tinder, and the country goes up in flames. That said, a number of the people who we have in elected office, the mayor of New York City probably among them, have deeply imbibed upon this ideology. You can see that even more particular, not just with the way that de Blasio is working with, say, Richard Carranza to remake the New York City school system completely in line with this ideology, but you see it also in the recent decision by the California state legislature, which voted to bring it up to a vote, I think, by the population of California in November, to remove all of the anti-discrimination verbiage from their state constitution, so that it's no longer California unconstitutional to discriminate, because they want to be able to enforce positive discrimination for their favored groups, which will also by default include negative discrimination against groups that they will define as dominant or unprotected. So this is, I mean, a lot of people have taken this up and they now see it as a moral emergency. With corporations specifically, I keep getting emails from CEOs and CIOs and COOs, all these different people in the C-suites that are telling me, well, we don't know what to do, but we know we have to do something because anybody who isn't doing something looks terrible. So it's moral panic speech. And we don't know what else to do. And then these materials are just being given to us. Everybody who does these seems to kind of satisfy the program. And so a very coordinated effort to push a lot of this kind of material onto everybody with an urgent message of you must do something now. Here's something you can do. And most alternatives are insufficient because we've defined them to be. That's the kind of milieu that the corporate C-suites are finding themselves in, whether they're just doing something because they feel like they have to in the present environment for business, whether they actually believe it. it's much harder to say, but you do still have that underlying moral panic, and you have this massive pressure. I mean, who in the right mind, if they were trying to run a business, would say, no, we're just not going to do anything with this. We're going to let it blow over. I mean, they're looting and burning down Targets and Starbucks. They'll destroy you if you came out publicly and tried to do it. So it's, simple risk management. Of course, that blows back the other way. And of course, they will make money off of it. Like, hey, here's our T-shirts and shoes that say Black Lives Matter, $150 a pop or whatever. So it's really kind of this bizarre, perverse set of incentives that's all kind of coming together at once. But again, it's the language of moral panic. It's the language of people who are out of control and knowing they have to do something and not knowing what to do.
You said they've been supplied with materials. What do you mean? Like, what do you mean? First of all, who is supplying those, and what are some of those? Like, black out your Instagram page or set up this committee?
Yeah, of course. So I've seen hundreds of examples, no, probably thousands of examples of statements from different companies, different schools, different universities, and even government agencies, cities, and the counties. And the language is so close to identical. I can't say that. I mean, it's not a very creative ideology, so a lot of it does sound the same, but the language is uncannily identical. I've also been sent just hundreds and hundreds of documents, like Google Docs. They're public, so it's not like there's some secret stolen thing. Google documents that are like, here are a list of resources that you can use to bring anti-racism into your workplace or your school or whatever, anti-racism resources Google Doc or whatever. And they're, again, all very similar. Like I said, we are now in a situation where we have a large number of nonprofit foundations. We have a large number of, in fact, our universities are basically, in many regards, not totally, but in significant regards within the humanities departments, de facto think tanks for this ideology. And they produce materials of this kind constantly. If you start looking into who's been giving money, you see multi-million-dollar grants going back, at least a decade or more. And what do they do with this money? Well, you write books like Anti-Racist Baby, Anti-Racist Preschool, and you start producing these kind of like easy to digest PDFs and infographics and things like that went out in a flood. So I don't think it's a conspiracy so much as I think that there are a large number of activists who have been waiting for a moment to seize, and the moment came, and they produce these materials kind of constantly. I mean, my own work had showed they were producing these materials constantly before this. So all of a sudden, they have these huge repositories of, hey, here's what you do for K through 3. Here's what you do through, 3 through 6, different grade levels. And they just have reams of materials that they just started to very rapidly send out to school systems, to CEOs, to everything else. And of course, they're selling these trainings that they have, and hundreds of or thousands of dollars per hour to come in and give anti-racist training. And here's a list of approved providers who have studied the relevant theory and know what we're talking about with anti-racism, the proper scholars. This stuff is all, it's not coordinated in the sense that they built a program and said, we're going to launch this into the world on, May 27th or whatever. It was more along the lines of that they are constantly building up materials. And then as the DOE chancellor in New York City, Richard Carranza, said that you just never let a crisis go to waste. So they moved on it the second the kind of right crisis arose. I can't deny at this point, seeing how much I've seen, that that's probably what happened. Billions of dollars have been going into producing these materials, these books, these resources for the past several years, and a moment to distribute them as widely as possible and move the football as far down the field as they could arose, and they took it, and they've got a first down again. I mean, they've gone way downfield, in fact.
Yeah. And I mean, like you said, it's big business. It's probably also de Blasio's best chance of getting reelected. They've weaponized race in a way that I've never seen done before, and they're riding this one. I mean, this is the biggest win. I think the left liberals, we'll have to talk about the difference between those two as well, have had in a while compared to all of Trump's survival and wins, and they're really running with it. So I guess it's natural to keep running with it, especially if you're in politics. I mean, you want to be reelected, and this is the one thing that is weaponized like almost to a nuclear level, where you can ride it out over anything, reasonable, right, logical, legal. It doesn't even matter anymore, because it's that phobia. It's the I don't want to be put in the racist card or the this card. And it feels like people are taking advantage of that.
That's exactly right. People are so paralyzed by any implication that they're in some form of complicity or activity with racism. They're so paralyzed by that that it is the kind of rhetorical equivalent of a nuclear weapon, and it is being deployed to massive effect. You could, and as you said, you can literally call it. You can find racism in anything. An example that we give in cynical theories is the following. So imagine that you are a shopkeeper and somebody comes into two people enter your store at roughly the same time, a black person and a white person. And you are, the nature of your shop, maybe it's like a clothing shop, is you're going to go up and you're going to greet people and you say, hey, how can I help you? That kind of normal behavior you see in a lot of shops. And so now you as a shopkeeper have a decision. Do you approach the black person or the white person first? You can only approach one. It's a zero-sum decision. You can just one person at a time. And the game is rigged so that you're wrong and it's racist no matter what you do. Because if you approach the white person first, that means you favor white people over black people and you are trying to treat the black person as a second-class citizen who has to wait. That's racist. But if you approach the black person first, that's because you are afraid that the black person is going to steal something, or that you wanted to get the black person out of your store as quickly as possible because you don't want black people in your store. And that's racist as well. And so you have a situation where the entire ideology that's pushing itself has this rhetorical nuclear weapon that it can apply in every situation because it's allowed to mind read. It's allowed to read the worst possible motivations in everybody's heads at every given instant. And the reason is because any possible whiff of being associated with racism will cause people to freak out and apologize and therefore admit that they were somehow racist. So with the shopkeeper, you could imagine somebody then coming up, whichever decision was made, and saying, well, don't you think that's a little bit racist? And then the shopkeeper says, well, how? And they say one of the two things that I just said, whichever the situation applies, or some other made up thing. And then the shopkeeper is stuck in this position like, oh my gosh, I hadn't considered it. I didn't even realize that I was being racist. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause offense. Because there's such a paralysis around being implicated in such a thing that people will bend over backwards and even believe that they had secret unconscious biases and unconscious motivations that led them to act in a racist way, that they are unable and totally incapable of understanding or even seeing in themselves. In fact, most of the literature in what's known as critical whiteness studies over the last decade has been dedicated to the project of explaining why white people never actually know how complicit in racism they are. And they are willfully ignorant about it. They don't know, and they don't want to know, and they don't even possess what are called the epistemic resources to possibly understand it. And then they don't have the racial stamina and racial humility to do the work to increase those epistemic resources. Reams of literature for the last 10 years, reams of it. I mean, it has been the standard in that entire line of thought. And again, this is being taught to our journalists in college. It's being taught to our children in schools. It's being taught in the diversity classes to every student who goes to university. It's in the popular narrative through the journalists. And people are picking it up. And then anybody who's sensitive to that, who hears that phrase, well, don't you think that was a little bit racist? Is suddenly caught in this trap where they start falling back into it and then apologizing and confessing and looking for how it was. And then there's that same theory coming along and saying, hey, well, let me explain to you this idea of white complicity. Here's why all white people are always complicit in racism at all times, whether they want to be or not, and there's nothing they can do about it. And that's you. And so the only real action you can take is to now acknowledge it and start trying to do better, to basically start thinking about race the way we think about race, which is all the time and in a very particular way, and act in accordance with that. In other words, join our religious faith about race and racism. So this is very, very well developed. Nobody's been looking at it. Nobody's been criticizing it for years in the academic literature. You still have mainstream academics running massive interference for it for the same reason. They don't want, if you criticize it, you must have racial motivations for criticizing it. So you must be a racist. No one's going to criticize it. There's no incentive to criticize it. It just causes you trouble and doesn't advance your career at all, doesn't get you any money, might get you fired. So why criticize it? So it's really kind of this perfect storm of, rhetoric being weaponized against people This is why I actually say that I think it's evil, is because it weaponizes their own best impulses and turns them into kind of almost zombies in service to the cause by saying, you need to care. I want you to care. And then the person's like, I do care. And they weaponize care. They weaponize concern that they've hurt somebody's feelings or they're offended them. They weaponize that. And there's something just profoundly evil about that.
I'm trying to think of equivalents, but it's like McCarthyism. If you were the communist, or you said the other guy wasn't a communist, you were the communist too. And the witch hunt in Salem, like if you said she's not a witch, you're a witch too. I mean, like you're looking at these parallels. This is stuff we do cyclically as humans, and we always take it to the max, don't we?
Yes. I mean, the closest parallels that I think there are to look at would be possibly the Bolshevik Revolution, and even more so Mao's Cultural Revolution, where you saw especially younger people in Mao's Cultural Revolution becoming the Red Guard that would go out and shame people for their complicity in the Four Olds and try to get them to do these struggle sessions, where they'd put them in public display, now on social media, back then in the public square, and humiliate them and yell at them until they cry and apologize in front of the crowd and promise to do better. The parallels, though, no matter which one you pick, are not exactly the shining moments of human history that we look back on and say, that's the future liberals want.
And what do you say to people who call you a racist, James, for bringing all this up?
I mean, so if somebody actually calls me a racist in practice right now, I mostly just ignore it. I get called a racist like 1,000 times a day on Twitter. I just don't care. But if it's somebody that actually maybe I feel like I need to respond to, in particular, like a friend or a family member, because if it's like some big account on Twitter, I'd just get sarcastic with them. I'm like, oh, you calling me a racist is you trying to hide the fact that you're a racist. Your white fragility is showing. I just flip it on them. But if it's like a friend or a family member, I start straight off with, well, what do you mean by that? When you say I'm a racist, very specifically, what do you mean by that? And let's clarify it. And because there is a legitimate problem with racism, and everybody, I think, should, nobody's required, this is a free country, nobody's required, but everybody should want to not be racist. That I would say that we should encourage such a norm. So people should be willing to reflect, but they should be willing to reflect on reasonable and fair terms that suit their own private consciences, not somebody else's terms that literally might be insane or the equivalent of witch hunts. So if somebody in my family or friends were to say, well, don't you think that's a bit racist? I would ask them to explain very clearly how that is, and then we could have a mature discussion about it. But if they start just saying, well, it's white fragility to deny it, or asking for evidence is itself a form of racism because if you lived it, you would already know. Like, I don't have any time for that. You're just wasting my time. And I actually have said that to somebody before, in a family member, as a matter of fact, it came after me with this. I just said, you're wasting my time. I don't have time for this stuff. Come back when you have a legitimate argument for why what I did was wrong, which was something I probably posted on Twitter. And then we can talk about it. And I just dismissed it. I just don't have time for it. And it estranged the relationship. That's going to happen. But it is what it is.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I've had similar conversations about freedom of speech with myself the last three months where, funny enough, like, professional services companies, I'd be on the phone with them and they'd be like, well, but that guy said this about this, isn't that wrong? And he was talking about 5G and they burned a 5G tower. And I'm like, yeah, they burned a 5G tower and he talked about that, but he should have the right to say that. And I get into these weird arguments and sometimes they don't go anywhere.
I remember when the ACLU stood up for the KKK's right to speak.
Yeah.
And this is actually a point, and I get in a lot of trouble. I've said this repeatedly. People get very angry with me when I say this. I always see the statement, racism has no place in our society. I disagree with that. I don't like it. I wish nobody would be racist. I wish we would have no racism. But again, it is not the business of a free society to say that any view is absolutely intolerable. And I say view, I didn't say action. You can have whatever view you want as a matter of private conscience. You cannot take whatever action you want. And so the blurring of this, and the failure to understand these differences, and the failure to understand that it's absolutely crucial to defend the most odious views, because if things are going wrong, if things are really tipping into fascism, guess which views are going to be considered odious and unable to be held? Those will be the true views. Those will be the right views. When racism was the law of the land, it was free speech. It was the ability to speak against slavery during the abolition movement. It was the ability to speak against the racism of Jim Crow that enabled those freedoms to be enacted. But free speech for one means free speech for all, because the second you start suppressing speech of anybody, it's just the caprice of whoever ends up having the levers of power who gets to decide what hate speech is and what hate speech is not, and gets to decide who can say what. And that's one of the greatest, and in fact, it is probably the greatest tool of oppression that's ever come up in human history, repeatedly come up in human history. And it's a lesson that clearly the people who wrote the Constitution learned very well, because they made it the first amendment of the United States that we're not going to abridge the freedom of speech. There are, of course, certain exceptions like clear and imminent threat, fighting words, or whatever they happen to be. But that's a different thing from holding a view that somebody finds offensive, or even that could be bad if put into practice. People have to have the right to follow their own private conscience and think and speak for themselves. And on the other side of it, people have the right to listen and to ignore whoever they want to listen to or ignore. This is a fundamental right of a free society, and no society that has significantly abridged it has ever done well for long.
Yeah, it's a very good point you make. I've recently had Noam Chomsky on and Alan Dershowitz, who both spent time as Jewish men defending, Nazis to have their protests or whatever. And Noam said he much prefers the American model, where you can be a Holocaust denier and it's legal because you'd say that, and most people just don't take you seriously.
Exactly.
Whereas in Europe, it's illegal to say, which in a weird way kind of almost gets them more press and or maybe it just gets led to its own dark place on the web where it goes unchecked. So
there's a natural moral currency to victimhood. So when somebody actually is being oppressed, there is more sympathy for their views. That's exactly what the current, whether you call it woke or critical social justice ideology, that's exactly what it's manipulating. So if you legitimately give somebody a thing to point to that says I'm being oppressed, that actually increases sympathy for their views. And you really don't want that for odious views. On the other hand, if we reach back to like John Stuart Mill, he was very clear, and he said, he who knows only his side of the argument knows little of that. And in that paragraph, following that very famous statement, he explains that we should learn the views that we disagree with from somebody who genuinely believes them and who can argue for them very eloquently and very clearly, because otherwise we lose the ability to understand and thus understand why those views are wrong. And so we rob all of ourselves, all of humanity, by banishing views that need counter arguments. Because if you don't know them well, you don't practice or become aware of the counter arguments, and thus people that start espousing them can start pushing them out unrestricted. There's no known counter. And you actually see this again with this same woke ideology, is if you actually start presenting them, I should say, with counter arguments, they very rarely can argue back very deeply, and they sometimes literally just start screaming. They don't know the counter argument. They don't, because they won't listen to the other side. And you see it playing out in real time. But of course, screaming at somebody or shouting at them or using thought-stopping techniques like check your privilege or don't you think that's a little bit racist? These are cult techniques, by the way. Thought-stopping techniques are cult indoctrination techniques. That's step one. But step two, if those people become empowered enough, is to start carting people off to prison or to start shooting them or to otherwise justify violence or property destruction. We're already seeing that happen.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.